This is Sky News. In just a moment, the press preview. A first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. First, though, our top stories. The Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, has confirmed his party is ditching its pledge to spend £28 billion a year on green projects. The former Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, says Rishi Sunak should apologise for a transgender jibe he made in the Commons yesterday. And an official investigation, which found President Biden willfully disclosed classified information, also said that he described himself as an elderly man with a poor memory. Hello there, you're watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. So it's time to see what's making the headlines with columnist and broadcaster Steve Richards and political commentator Benedict Spence. They'll be with us from now until just before midnight. So let's see what is on some of those front pages. Well, the FT leads with Sir Keir Starmer's decision to slash his commitment to spending £28 billion a year on green investment, blaming former Prime Minister Liz Truss for the economic decisions that she took while in power. The Guardian says there's fury among Green campaigners, unions and energy bosses after the decision. The Mail asks, can you ever believe a word Sir U-turn says? The Eye returns to its investigation into the Post Office computer scandal, reporting that the company has admitted a second faulty IT system may have led to more wrongful prosecutions of sub-postmasters. The Mirror leads with what it calls a shock report into the state of children's teeth in Britain. The Metro reports on the trial of a conspiracy theorist who claimed that survivors of the 2017 Manchester Arena bombing faked their injuries. The judge has already called the claims absurd. The Sun leads with the possibility of blue cards coming into football to banish players to the off-field sin bin. And the Star has news of broadcaster Paul Gambaccini's problems with foxes messing with his newspapers. They're apparently very loud at night. And a reminder that by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the program, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's papers while you watch us. And we are joined tonight by Steve Richards and Benedict Spence. Thank you both so much for coming in. So let's take a look at the front pages. I mean, same story, front page of The Guardian and the Daily Mail. Let's take a look at The Guardian. First, furious Starmer stages U-turn on that £28 billion green investment pledge. There was a lot of lead up to this, but they officially announced today at 5 p.m. that they were indeed scrapping it. What do you make of it, Steve?
Well, I'm sure they think, Keir Starmer and his team, they can put up with these front-page headlines today, and then it will get better because they have a more credible policy, in inverted commas. However, I think what happens in these situations, and navigating tax and spend before an election is a nightmarish task, I understand that. But when you are seen to be in retreat against a Conservative Party at its weakest in its history, I don't think people say, oh, wow, retreat, how grown up. They come for the next bit. So now you have Keir Starmer quoting The Guardian saying, we can now focus on the outcomes. Now, that's right, you need to focus on the outcomes. However, British general elections, partly unfairly, are all about means. So how are you going to do this? How are you going to do that? And I think having removed this lever, which was going to generate economic growth, one of the missions, central to the Green Recovery Plan, one of its missions, part of an industrial strategy, part of a mission. They are losing a key lever, and these opponents will come in and the media will come in saying, oh, how? And unless there are really detailed, credible answers, they're going to fall into another trap, having avoided a trap which is kind of rooted in the 1992 election when Labour lost because of tax bombshell allegations and that their sums didn't add up. Well, do their sums add up now?
Benedict, before coming to you, let's just look at the Daily Mail. Obviously, same story, and actually, in a way, same negative angle. Can you ever believe a word Sir U-turn says? So, Labour really getting it from all sides on this. Do you think it was the right decision?
I don't think it's necessarily a bad decision to scrap ideological policies for pragmatic reasons, and there's no question that the Labour Party is very cautious at the moment, far more cautious than you might imagine a party in the ascendancy to be. But that is because I think it has been badly stung by being overly ideological in the past. And that, we need to remember, was the remit that Keir Starmer was elected as Labour leader to be, was to detoxify the party. He's had to work very hard to get the party into a position, I think, where people trust it. And even now, people are not going to vote for it with any great relish. They're doing it because they really loathe the Conservatives. I think, though, that you've seen this actually as a fairly common theme throughout the last couple of months, and that is Labour being incredibly cautious on what it says it will and will not spend. We've heard this a lot from Rachel Reeves, saying that there is no magic money tree, even being interviewed, profiled very positively by The Telegraph, of all papers, saying that actually they're taking this very seriously. Wes Streeting saying there is no money for the NHS and there will have to be reform rather than just spending going into it. And this ultimately is because I do think Keir Starmer recognises and the Labour Party recognise that the world that they're going to inherit is not something that they are going to be able to just control magically and have lots of solutions for. We are very much at the mercy of forces, it must be said, beyond the economic mismanagement of the Conservative Party, but that certainly played a part. But it must be said, there is an element of hilarity to this, which is that, the Conservatives had their great big relaunch a couple of days ago, and they put Liz Truss front and centre as, for some reason, thinking that that would really work. And then Keir Starmer was able to turn around and go, remember her? Well, now because of her, we can't do this. So I'm sure that will have really gone down well amongst the popcorn group.
Very important to have a grown-up conversation about these issues where spending is involved, and to be honest and say that now, especially as the old commitment had already been pushed back to the end of the next Parliament, it's absurd to say we guarantee something. I mean, the whole economy could have imploded. But, as I say, there are risks, bizarrely, in being cautious. And the risks also are about a sense of momentum and direction. Now, often, actually, opposition parties, especially Labour opposition parties, are quite hesitant and evasive, and are right to be so. But when you advertise that hesitancy and evasiveness, you're in some trouble. Now, I'm saying this in the context of this huge Labour lead, and Keir Starmer deserves some of the credit for that huge Labour lead. But they're copying quite a lot of New Labour in '97. But part of the artistry of that period was they gave the impression of constant movement and momentum. There was none of this sense of retreat and endless briefings that they were going to retreat from this, from that and that. And so I can see trouble ahead, to be honest, over this retreat. I can see why they did it. I can fully understand the problem with a figure. However, anyone who thinks they've escaped this whole area of scrutiny, I think, kidding themselves. And the first interviews with Keir are going to be very interesting. And you watch that question, OK, so you're not doing it that way, so how are you going to do it? And I'm not quite sure what the answer is at the moment.
I think, frankly, that they're damned either way. As I say, I think that the economic circumstances mean that whatever it is that they inherit, they're going to have a lot less sympathy from the public than the Conservatives have had. They've lost it a very long time, the Conservatives, been able to get away with an awful lot. I think the last few years have really shortened the public's mood for putting up with economic pain.
Because the government itself has walked back on some of its pledges when it comes to the environment not that long ago. So.
Absolutely. I think that environmentalism is something that everybody is superficially in favour of. Everybody wants to live in a nice, green, pleasant land. It's when it gets to the question of cost and implementation that it does get a little bit tricky. And I think when people are looking broadly at their services breaking down, people will start to say, actually, is this the most important way of driving growth? And I don't think that that's an unfair thing for people to jump on.
I mean, of course, the changing economic situation is one of the reasons why he announced this U-turn. So let's look at The Guardian. Again, front page, a story here about the war in Ukraine. So Volodymyr Zelensky replacing Ukraine's top general, obviously not particularly happy with the way the war is going. Steve.
Yeah, and I fear there was an inevitability about this phase. I've been on this newspaper review when there has been some event which has triggered questions about, well, Ukraine's winning this, isn't it? It looks as if it's a disaster for Putin. Ukraine has won. And yet, if you step back, Russia is one of the big military superpowers against Ukraine, a fragile Western alliance helping them. And I think there were always going to be internal tensions as well as all the external tensions, Trump, what Germany are going to do, what Britain's going to do. And it's inevitable in that context that leaders within Ukraine are going to fall out, and that seems to have happened.
Yeah.
Everybody that I speak to who is an expert on this topic seems to believe that Ukraine has lost. That is something that is very difficult, actually, for Western audiences to stomach, given the amount of support that we still have for the Ukrainians, and we don't want Ukraine to be swallowed up by Russia. That is not to say that Russia will swallow Ukraine, but on the subject of the territories that Russia has already taken, it is very difficult to see, given the failure of the spring offensive last year, which was the brainchild of Valery Zaluzhny, the man who has lost his job. It's very hard to see how they take that back. The key stat, the average age of a conscript in Ukraine is now 43 years old. That is how devastating this war has been for the young population. They simply don't have the men. It's no longer a question of military equipment or of Russia's desire for it. It is how many men they can physically muster. They don't have them.
And we're coming up to the 2-year anniversary. I think it's February 23rd or something like that. We can look, speaking of, it's not the ammunition, it's the men. If we look at the Financial Times, they actually have a story there, Kyiv falling behind in the ammunition it needs to counter Russia. I mean, I guess the question is, they may be losing the war, but there are huge political issues, political reasons why the West, especially the EU, would keep on helping them.
Yeah, or not, as the case may be. So the United States, with Trump hovering, explicitly saying he wants to end the whole thing, are not going to continue with that. And that's a huge $60 billion hanging in the balance. And there are tensions within Europe as well. So once you got to a point, did you say it's 3 years? It's not 2 years. Is it 3 years ago it started?
No, two years. So we're coming into the third year.
Third year, yeah. It was always going to be challenging to sustain. And so unless there was this sort of mythical quick victory in Ukraine, I think this was, I'm afraid, inevitable as we enter year 3.
Ben, if you got 10 seconds.
I've got 10 seconds. I think the key that we're seeing is the changes in neighbouring countries in Europe, Poland especially, how much they're now spending on ammunition, and elsewhere across the globe. If you look at how much Japan, for example, is spending on its military establishment, I think the rest of the world has woken up actually to the fact that you can't just take these things for granted and that the war won't come to you.
Benedict, Steve, thank you so much. Stay with us, because coming up, The Independent says Rishi Sunak faces growing pressure to apologise for his joke about trans people, including from one of his very own ministers.
I was actually in Poland lecturing at a conference there. The next day, climbed a mountain and had a seizure, and then that's when it had some scans which showed I had a mass in my brain, which turned out to be this glioblastoma, nasty type of brain cancer. But yeah, I was devastated. I know what cancer means, having dedicated my life to the diagnosis and treatment of cancer. To be diagnosed with brain cancer, the worst subtype, which basically is incurable cancer. Treatment hasn't changed in almost 20 years, didn't sit right with me.
After the grief, which is still ongoing, really, it's a very grim diagnosis. I set about thinking, what could we do, knowing that glioblastoma, the treatment had not changed in 20 years, being a medical oncologist. So I started thinking about how we could apply what we know in melanoma and what we've forged and discovered in melanoma about treating with immunotherapy before surgery. It actually makes the immunotherapy more effective, like a sniffer dog sniffing out drugs. If you are trained to know the drugs, when you go to the airport, you can sniff them out better. We know in melanoma that by giving the immunotherapy first before surgery, we actually get a much more sustained and effective, durable anti-cancer control from the patient's own immune system. So that was the first step. And then coming up with the novel combination, which has never been used across the world, except in early melanoma trials. And so this is what I set about with our team from our lab. Then the most important bit was what we did with that research tissue. So planning and strategizing with Richard about resecting the tissue with our surgeon and making sure that we did all the right experiments in our lab to prove we actually activated the immune system. The drugs, the immune activators got into the tumor inside his brain, And we could see an increase in all these immune cells within his tumour. So we were really pleased with those early results.
Welcome back. You're watching the press preview with me once again, columnist and broadcaster Steve Richards and the political commentator Benedict Spence. Okay, let's take a look now. Front page of The Independent. And it's this story about a comment that Rishi Sunak made in the Commons directed to Keir Starmer about, what is a woman, with the mother of Brianna Ghey, who was not there at the time but came a little later. Now, apparently members of his own party are asking, saying he should reflect on not apologising. Bennett, do you think he should apologise?
It's tricky because I think the tone that was struck was obviously very insensitive, given the topic. However, it shouldn't be off the table for a Prime Minister to point out that members of both parties have struggled with the fact that biological sex is a matter of chromosomal disposition and it is immutable. That is something that the Labour Party have struggled with, but it is also something, rather curiously, that members of the Conservative Party have struggled with, including this particular individual, Penny Mordaunt, who has stood at the dispatch box and said trans women are women, and then backtracked on it later when she realised, oh, actually, that's not the most popular stance when you're trying to become leader of the Conservative Party. So for her to now come back halfway, if you like, and say he got the tone wrong, I think is rather curious. Very clearly, she still has leadership ambitions, I suspect, after the next general election. But as to whether or not he should apologise for what he said on the topic, as I say, it shouldn't be off the table to discuss this. I think the tone, the slightly sort of jovial nature, which is what we get at Prime Minister's questions, was wrong. But I will also say, equally, so was Sir Keir Starmer's impression of Greta Thunberg meets Hamlet, of sort of hamming it up as much as possible and actually bringing the family into the equation without necessarily them wanting to be brought into the equation in front of the entire nation.
I don't think he was hamming it up. I thought he was genuinely shocked at a Prime Minister displaying such insensitivity. And that's clearly what Penny Mordaunt thought. I don't know, I saw the clip of this as reflected in The Independent, and either she thought Sunak was going to make some sort of apology or she was making a heck of a lot of mischief. But it is an example of a dilemma political leaders fall into, which is if they apologise, it's sort of admitting a terribly crass error. And that's very difficult, actually, for leaders to do. I think this will you say sorry, which is a question repeated at political leaders these days, is actually unfair. But Sunak was insensitive, and I think Starmer was sincere in his response. I don't think he thought this time Sunak would make kind of tricky, kind of mischievous points about the trans issue.
I just don't think that that's who Sir Keir Starmer is. I think he's a very seasoned lawyer. I think he knows all about the performance. And I also thought that the giveaway was the fact that nobody on his own backbenchers realised what was going on until a good few seconds after he'd started. They were all still laughing and smiling because they thought it was all part of the pantomime. It was a few seconds later that they realised, oh, hang on, we're not supposed to be smiling. I thought Rachel Reeves, in particular, is there with a broad smile on her face, even as Sir Keir Starmer is pointing to the gallery. I thought that was the giveaway.
I guess not apologising kind of drags it out. I mean, it may be right or wrong, but...
But apologising would stir it as well in a different way. I mean, it's a trap. It happens to leaders when they're in trouble, and it can fuel more trouble for them, whichever way they go.
Okay, front page of the Eye now. Post Office admits second IT scandal may be linked to wrongful prosecutions. And this is, they say, possible wrong prosecutions because of faults in its capture IT system, Benedict, so not Horizon.
Not Horizon, predating it. We obviously need to wait to hear the full explanation, although hopefully not as long as we had to wait for Horizon.
No.
But it's just, it's one thing after another with yet another previously trusted institution in the UK. And we go back to it, don't we? The culture of cover-ups, of covering people's backs, that it takes things so long to come out and therefore for justice to be served. And you just hope, actually, that this isn't anywhere near as bad. You know, the Eye is saying that it could be, but let's wait and see. He is hoping that nobody has been as wronged as badly as in the previous scandal.
Yeah, good advice. Let's wait and see, because we don't know the details. But it is part of a pattern which is familiar and I suspect will come down to a lack of accountability at many different levels that explains this nightmare, from having a post office minister every 10 seconds to the weird hybrid of being publicly owned but distant from government and many other things. And this is, I think, will be part of a familiar, deeply worrying and depressing pattern.
Steve, Benedict, we're going to have to leave it there for now. Thank you both so much. Now let's take a look at the weather.
Warm memories wherever you go. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Well, there'll be further rain around tomorrow with the focus of snow moving to Scotland, where eastern hills look most at risk. There'll be a freezing start to the day in parts of the windy north, while the far south looks very mild. Expect some rain through the morning, most prolonged in the north, where snow is possible, mainly on the hills. Low cloud will bring fog to some coasts and hills. It'll be mild in the south again, cold in the north.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.